And I have to say that I found Doug's work really fascinating, and I probably wouldn't have even looked into it until I had an interview with Zen Garcia a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have seen that or listened to that show. You can check it out in the archives if you haven't. And he put a few seeds in my mind regarding the creation account, and I've always kind of held what's called the gap theory, kind of, I don't know, at arm's length, I guess. I mean, I've remained open to it. I've looked at Genesis 6:1 and 2, and I've read a lot of the arguments regarding the so-called gap theory there, and I found it really interesting because right away you see, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then all of a sudden it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and talks about the Spirit of God moving across the face of the waters. Well, the first thing I thought of, and this is years ago, I mean, I'm talking probably 15, 20 years ago, I was looking at that, and I was thinking, where'd the water come from? And some people would say, well, when God created the earth, he created the water with it. But it doesn't appear to be that way, at least to me. When you look at the Hebrew word, even for heavens, Shemaim, Ma'im is the word for water, and Shem is the word for name. Shem, I think, has something to do with in it. Some say that the word heaven itself means water in it. So it appears that the heavens and the earth actually came out of the water. And when you look at all of the various things in the creation account, it's the one element that is not actually described as being created. It appears to just be there. So I've always had a question mark regarding the whole Genesis 6:1 and 6:2 and the possibility of a gap in there. And but I never really did much with it until I talked with Zen Garcia. And he planted a few seeds in my mind regarding that whole idea, and the idea of the war of God and Leviathan, or the dragon, or Tiamat, or Rahab, the various different names that battle the dragon, the sea serpent, or whatever is known by. And when he planted that seed, I started looking, and I realized that when I bought Tom Horn's special package deal in the David Flynn collection, that Doug Elwell's book, Planet X, the sign of the Son of Man and the sign of the Son of Man and the end of the age, actually came with the David Flynn set. So I started looking through it, and I said, oh man, I got to talk to this guy. So I contacted him via email through his website, and he's going to be on the show tonight. Douglas is the publisher of Mysterious World. You might want to check that website out. It's really cool. MysteriousWorld.com, an online journal dedicated to travel, history, and the ancient mysteries of the world. Doug has a master's degrees in Biblical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies and Marketing Communications from Wheaton College Graduate School, and voluminous amounts of experience in researching and writing on religion, history, mythology, and travel. And his first book, Mysterious World Ireland, received critical acclaim, and he's got a few more out there, including the one we're going to talk about tonight, Planet X, the sign of the Son of Man and the end of the age. So it is my great privilege to welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project, Douglas Elwell. Doug, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks so much for coming on. I've just begun your book. I'm probably 50 pages or so into it, and it's blowing my mind. So I'm excited to talk with you about this stuff tonight. But let's go back a little bit further and help us understand who you are beyond the introduction I just gave you. How did you come to know Christ, and how did you even become interested in subjects like Nephilim and giants, Planet X, and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I come from a very conservative, traditional family, a very Christian family. My parents were both saved when they were in their teens and 20s, and they took their faith very seriously, and they ingrained that faith in myself and my brother very strongly as soon as we could understand the word Jesus. And then as soon as we were able to understand it, what that meant, they had us confess Christ, I believe, when I was maybe less than 5 years old. You know, I didn't really maybe understand completely what was going on. I felt it in my heart. So since then, I felt that I'd been saved, and really kind of felt that I had meant to be saved. I'm actually kind of leaning towards more of a predestinational perspective. So that's guaranteed to offend someone. So, but I tend to be more of a predestinational type person, as if people were meant to be saved. God shows you. But so along those lines, I come from a very conservative background theologically, which some people might find surprising, given some of the outlandish and non-traditional approaches I use with books such as Planet X and the Giants, even though technically the book on the Giants is the conservative viewpoint writ large. I take that conservative viewpoint literally, saying there literally were fallen angels that came down and literally interbred with human women and literally created giant men and women. And so that's actually the conservative viewpoint. So you can see how topsy-turvy things are in these end times when the conservative traditional viewpoint is considered to be strange, and the liberal viewpoint is taken as normative, because the viewpoint that, for example, there's three major theories about the giants. One that they were actually the descendants of fallen angels and mortal women. The other is that they were just oriental despots who conquered and controlled people through use of force, and others just regular men who were just very aggressive. And the third one was it was actually men from the line of Seth, which makes no sense. Because the line of Seth is exactly the opposite of that kind of aggression. They were godly men who descended from Seth, from whom Jesus was eventually born. The line of Cain, of course, was destroyed by the flood, so Seth was the only one who continued on through Noah and on through the post-flood world. But so I'm very conservative theologically. But when it comes to the Bible, I like to look to modern science and new understandings of archaeology and of mythology to understand or to glean new and better understandings of the Bible. This is actually normative for academic level stuff. When you get into academic level stuff like Mike Heiser does, I could have continued on in that path like he did, but I decided to go more towards technology as a career, but I still studied the Bible in its original languages on my own. And when I studied in grad schools, they actually do study the Bible in its cultural context, and a lot of our modern translations of the Bible are actually based on better understandings of ancient Near Eastern mythology, ancient Near Eastern contract law, things of that nature. We have a much better understanding of the dating of the scriptures based on, for example, the Pharaonic kings list of the Egyptians and the dating of certain styles of contract that were written in the ancient Near East. We can date, for example, the time period when Joseph was sold for, I believe it was 30 shekels of silver. That was actually the specific time period in ancient history where that was the price of a slave, so we could date him to that period and prove that if Joseph lived during that time. Things like that. And so I treat astronomy the same way, is that when you come with new understandings of astronomy, you then need to apply these to our understanding of the creation so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on. And if you have a revolutionary improvement in our understanding of astronomy, you're going to have a revolutionary improvement in our understanding of the creation. I believe that's what I've come across and talk about in my book, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age.
Very good. I've spent a little bit of time poking around your website as well, Mysterious World. How did that come about? How did you get into all the stuff that's on that website?
I've noticed there was not really a Christian perspective on some of these mysterious topics, and I tend to take a little more lenience towards non-biblical texts and extra-biblical texts like and ancient histories that are outside of the Bible. For example, South American history, North American history, European history. I take these things seriously, and I like to apply them to my understanding of the Bible. I use the biblical understanding as kind of the center post around which I array all these other ancient mythologies and histories and kind of do comparison and contrast and see where there are parallels. And as such, it's like my academic training, except I extend it to a worldwide scope rather than just ancient Near Eastern texts. I extend it, how was the world back then? How do people think? And there are numerous parallels and indications that the giants, for example, spread all over the world, not just ancient Near East. They were conquered the entire world. That was, in fact, their purpose, in my opinion, was to conquer the world and take over the various tribes of the nations in order to form royal classes which would rule over them on behalf of the fallen angels who would use them as sort of an intermediary. And those royal classes are still in place today. For example, the royals of England are probably descended from Nephilim stock, as are all the other royalties that still remain. And probably why they may call them blue bloods, because their blood literally is different from most people's for that reason.
So you do subscribe to the idea that many of the world leaders could actually be of a different race, let's say, than the human race?
They are modified humans. They have been altered. They've intermarried with standard Homo sapiens for a long time now, so there's not much difference. But in ancient times, thousands of years ago, in some cases hundreds, they were very similar. They were actually fairly dissimilar from standard humans. They're much taller, much stronger, and there was distinct differences. And there's a number of references to giants of the ancient world, even ancient Europe, that were much taller than the average person. So there are actual records of giants in the world, not just ancient Near East or even Europe. They're all over the place. So we can find an example here. There were no, let me find a specific name. There's actually the giant German ruler, for example. If I can find his name. Maximinus, that's right. He was the Roman emperor. He was actually 8.5 feet tall. And he was actually an enormous man. He wasn't simply suffering from some sort of pituitary disorder. He was literally a giant man who was extremely powerful, who could outrun horses, and even at one time he even knocked out a horse's teeth with one punch. This guy was so strong. He was actually from Bulgaria. He was an old Bulgarian giant, and he was actually able to outrun horses, and he ate probably enough for 10 men every day. In fact, after a while, the army so admired this man they made him emperor. But he actually ended up bankrupting Rome because he offered the army's double pay and had to sack all of the old temples, the priests of all their gold and everything just to pay the army. So he eventually was deposed and assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. But he was a literal giant, 8.5 feet tall in real history. Maximilian, the emperor of one of the Holy Roman Empires, was actually, I think he was over 8 feet tall as well, and he was also very strong. He would wrestle with lions, and he could outrun mountain goats, and even climb mountains faster than mountain goats could, according to the stories. And he was a classic example of an ancient giant in modern times, relatively modern times. I believe he lived about 400 years ago. And maybe it was 700 or 800 years ago. Actually, yeah, it was 1493. And he was an honest-to-goodness giant in recorded history. So these people actually did live, and they actually were a part of royal lines. Maximilian being a classic example of a Germanic giant that formed a royal line from whom his descendants are still German royalty. So when I say I believe they're German royalty, it's because that's what the history says.
Yeah, that's interesting. Somebody had done an animation showing wars throughout history, and they basically showed the globe, and it showed little explosions going off in different places where wars had taken place over, I think it was about the last 1,000+ years or so. And the bigger the explosion, the bigger the war, and the more the casualties, you know. So of course, when you see like World War I and World War II, there's some pretty big explosions, you know, all over Europe and whatnot. But what struck me as I was watching that animation is that literally for at least 1,000 years, a lot of wars have been started in Germany.
Yes, those are the homeland of the ancient Germanic giants. The largest, strongest, and most fierce of all the giants. In fact, all the other giants were actually afraid of them, even the Gaulish giants whom Caesar fought against in his campaigns against the Gauls. He actually wrote about this in his writings about how huge the Gauls were, and they would fight naked. They were upwards of 8 feet tall, had huge two-handed swords, and just could go through men like a lawnmower. And the only way the Romans could defeat the Gaulish giants was by forming phalanxes and using arrows and javelins, because they were vulnerable to arrows and javelins because they did not use armor, believing their gods would protect them. So they eventually wiped out all the Gauls after massive casualties, but they eventually killed them all. But the Germani were the most aggressive of all, and those are the ones that Hitler tried to rebreed in his master race ideology, which was based on real history. He actually went around to the various areas like Poland and northern France looking for tall blonde children, and he brought them back to state-sponsored brothels called Lebensraum in order to try to rebreed the master race. And meanwhile, then I forget the name of the Nazi doctor. He was actually trying to rebreed the giants by breeding people specifically for that purpose. He actually, Mengele was his name.
Yeah, Mengele.
The story of Boys from Brazil was basically based on a real story, where he was actually experimenting with people and trying to rebreed the giants, and that's why you have a lot of blue-eyed children in certain parts. I think it was, if not Brazil, I think it was actually in Argentina. But he was actually doing these experiments, trying to rebreed this giant race, and that's the reason he was experimenting on children in Auschwitz, particularly twins, because I think that his theory was that a giant was basically a conjoined twin that had been fused in a womb to one large person. It's based on his research. I backwards extrapolated that. I think that was probably his theory. Perhaps occasionally in history you hear of two-headed giants. That is most likely a conjoined twin. It was basically two heads in one body, which does actually happen. It can happen. It's happened in recorded history and medical history. So the idea of the Germanic giants, they were trying to rebreed them, was actually based on real history. These people actually did exist, and Hitler made a real attempt to bring these people back.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me, and the fact that he was looking for blonde hair and blue eyes, which both are recessive genes. Would you say that is a carryover maybe of Nephilim genetics? I mean, why were they choosing that specific characteristic and apparently trying to carefully select to backwards engineer the Nephilim, it seems like?
I'm not sure why they're blonde-haired and blue-eyed. That just seems to be the way it is. Perhaps something about the genetics makes them easier to control, spiritually speaking, and it might be easier for a demon to inhabit, maybe. That's the main reason they were bred that way, is because they could easily be happy inhabited. As Tom Horn says in his writings, the giants were created to be fit extensions for the fallen angels to inhabit and control in a sort of a possession sort of way through various rituals. They were able to, the giants willingly allowed themselves to be possessed by demons from the ancient world. That is why in the world before the flood, the giants, the premier breed of giants, which are the direct descendants of the fallen angels, were called the Nephilim, or those who came down, and those, by extension, were born from those who came down from heaven to earth. But in the world after the flood, you don't hear about the Nephilim. They were replaced by a group called the Rephaim, which literally means either those who are healed or those who are reborn and resurrected.
Right.
So the theory is that the giants, the spirits of the Nephilim, who've been wandering the earth since the flood, since their bodies were destroyed, were given new bodies that were recreated by by the fallen angels who came down again after the flood. As Moses said, giants that were in the earth these days and also afterwards. The fallen angels came down again, started rebreeding the giants again. This is what the iniquity of the Amorites was referred to in the book of Genesis, when God says to Abraham, "Do not tarry in Canaan, because the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet come to the full." He was talking about how the fallen angels were once again rebreeding the giants. And so Abraham was told to go off into Egypt. And his descendants, the Israelites under Moses, would return later, and they would destroy the giants as a holy army designed specifically for that purpose. So the Rephaim were those who were reborn from giants that were specifically bred for that purpose, so that the fallen angels could inhabit those bodies and possess them and control them, in this way interact with the earth and enjoy its earthly pleasures in that way.
Now, along those lines, I read something on your website, and Tom Horn actually quoted you in his book Pandemonium's Engine in chapter 1, and it appears to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't believe that we're talking about the giants after the flood here, that they were the product of copulation. In other words, it wasn't about sex, angels having sex with women, but rather scientific manipulation of DNA to create Homo artificialis, or is that what you...
Correct. Yes, it's not possible for an angel to have procreation with a human female, because angels are not married or given in marriage. If they could procreate, they would simply procreate with each other and make more angels that way. The whole purpose of the human race was to create more workers, beings to populate the earth. But these angels forsook their first estate and broke the divinely mandated barrier of, do not come down and manipulate my creation. This is my creation. God created it. But they came down and did that. And they modified the genome of the human being. My theory is that Cain was the first giant. And the way that he could be of the serpent seed, but also born of Adam and Eve, as is clearly written, is that, as you have with modern-day UFO abductions, what they did was they took an egg out of Eve's ovum, modified it, reimplanted it, and that was what Adam fertilized. So they had Adam and Eve and Satan as the parents. In a sense, Cain had two daddies in that case. And he was a modified human. I believe he was a giant also, even though it's not explicitly stated. And it is from his line that the giants eventually were bred by additional groups of fallen angels, probably 200 or so, if we're to believe the Book of Enoch. But there are, of course, many more. But the leadership probably used them, specifically a group of 72 of them, one for each of the nations, used them to create a royal line through which they could use to rule the nations. And that is the purpose of the giants, was to rule the nations as proxies for the fallen angels who have since that time controlled the earth. This is how Satan controls the earth, through his proxies, through these royal lines, and through these secret societies like the Freemasons and so forth. It's all quite clear once you understand the big picture. This is the purpose of these secret societies, is to allow people to be willingly possessed by these beings, to get this earthly power from them, and in return give these beings the ability to interact with the physical world. That's the whole point of it.
That's I've not heard that take on Genesis 6 before. That's very interesting. Do you liken that to what it was written about the Anunnaki in the Mesopotamian text regarding them?
Ancient, the Mesopotamian text, the Greek texts, I think probably the Roman also, all talk about how the quote-unquote gods came down from heaven to earth and procreated with mankind, creating demigods like Hercules and Achilles. These were all half-man, half-divine beings, those heroes of renown. Moses was talking about people like Hercules, like Achilles, even though they came afterwards. That type of person who had superhuman abilities and had super strength. And it probably, I believe, also technological capabilities, what we would call technological. Advanced weaponry, advanced armor. Goliath actually had what was called a new sword, which was, I believe, based on the word hokmah, which is a wise sword, or a sword that is skillfully wrought. Something that is advanced by Hebrew characteristics, which means it would have been superior to bronze, which means it could have been iron or even steel. It's possible, but that's what they meant. So there are instances, I believe, not only of genetic manipulation, but also of technology that the fallen angels gave to their offspring in order to help them maintain control over the masses. That is kind of their MO. They are genetically manipulated to be made quote-unquote superior, and also given technology in order to be able to enforce their will over others. That's how they operate.
How would you define the Anunnaki?
Anunnaki literally means those who came from heaven to earth. Anu means heaven. Ki means earth. Na, I suppose, comes down to, but that's basically what it means. The Anunnaki were the biblical, Mesopotamian equivalent of the biblical fallen angels. What they were talking about in the Bible is not just fallen angels of Canaan, but all over the earth. They were describing how fallen angels came down from heaven to earth. And you're going to have something that important is going to show up in other traditions inside the Bible. They'll have a different take on it and a different point of view, but they'll all be talking about beings who came down from heaven to earth and interacted and procreated with mankind. And that's what you see with the Anunnaki, what you see with the Deus Ex Machina of the Romans, where the gods came down and gave man technology and interbred with the women. Zeus was constantly talking about having offspring with human women. That was a very regular thing in the mythology. Apollo had his children. Very common. In fact, it's a normative or even central concept in ancient, not only in the Bible, but also in ancient Near Eastern religion and Greek and Roman religion. It's one of the most common themes that there is. So I have no problem at all believing it, because that's what they believed.
Yeah. Now, but like in the case of Zeus, he's usually recorded as having sex. I mean, his sex life was pretty well known in the mythology.
Well, he would appear as various animals, so that's probably not what happened.
Yeah.
They were probably trying. They don't understand science as we understand it. What they thought, they thought it was just like a deity procreating with this woman, but it was actually what you would call scientific. I believe it was a medical experimentation, what we would call scientific medicine, where a test tube child who was briefly inseminated inside the test tube and then reimplanted in the womb and grew from there. Even Irish mythology has the changelings, where people were replaced with sickly-looking children, and then the good children were taken away by these fairy beings. It's literally all over the world, this concept of these divine beings interfering with the procreation of children and using human women to breed themselves and create more of themselves, because they were apparently incapable of doing it themselves. If they were capable of doing it themselves, they would do that and they would leave us alone. But they treat us like breeders, like human women are like breeding cattle almost. It's fodder for their experimentation.
What's your take on the Igigi?
The Igigi or the Igigi, probably just a different class of spirit beings, different class of fallen angels, maybe the angels of the Bible, I really don't know. I think Igigi, they're probably equivalent to the Watchers of the Book of Enoch. I believe that they were called the Watchers sometimes in the Mesopotamian texts. It's not really clear. But they were the equivalent of the Watchers in Enoch, even though they don't have the same name.
Yeah, I wonder
different classes of spirit being.
I wonder if linguistically there's a connection between, because I've heard the Watchers referred to as the Grigori, and if there's a connection between the Igigi and the Grigori.
There might be. I don't know. I think that the Mesopotamians do refer to them as the Watchers. The Watchers are referred to literally as the Anuna in the Mesopotamian myths. Anuna is cognate with the word ayin in Hebrew, which means eye. So the Anuna of the Mesopotamian myths are literally mean the eyes, i.e. those that watch. Thus we get the term Watchers in the Book of Enoch. These beings are watching us all the time and constantly monitoring every move and interacting with those people over whom they have authority.
I know some people think, based on what you just said, related to the eye, related to the idea of watching, that being associated with eyes and seeing. if the so-called alien grays are, in fact, what they're talking about with their big bulbous eyes. What's your take on the grays?
Grays are probably, if not actual fallen angels, possibly mechanical, biomechanical beings created by the fallen angels to achieve certain repetitive tasks. Fallen angels would appear, if we're to believe the Book of Enoch, to be highly technologically sophisticated, even if we're to take the Book of Enoch seriously, and also what is alleged in the book of Genesis, chapter 4, because all the descendants of Cain were technologically sophisticated, particularly in metalworking and music and related arts and sciences, whereas the descendants of Seth, where there's no mention of any technology at all. But the Book of Enoch says that all learning was derived or given to mankind from the fallen angels, and that would include technology. And so technology of any kind, including advanced technology, would indicate that they were able to create what we would call robots, or artificial life forms, genetically alter human beings, to get back to the giants, but a lot of other stuff too. And giants, Moses was more generic in his description of giant. He says, men of renown and people with exceptional abilities. Giant doesn't just mean, giant, by the way, comes from is related to the Greek word giganes. The English word giant comes from the Greek word giganes, which literally is the word which we get our word genetics. So baked in or spliced into the word, the concept of giant is someone who's been genetically altered. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean someone who is tall and strong. It could mean someone who is exceptionally intelligent or been genetically modified for any kind of use, including space travel. So it's possible the grays that are a form of humanity that have been specifically genetically engineered for space travel. And because when people who have noted the grays note that they are kind of ideal for space travel because they're very light, very tough, they have huge wraparound eyes that are black, which are perfect for gathering large amounts of light, which is necessary for space. So in my opinion, the grays may actually be a long-lost race of genetically modified humans which have been enslaved by the fallen angels for use in various tasks in space.
That's very interesting too. A lot of people these days that do this kind of research, we look at Matthew 24:37, for instance, and where Jesus says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man." And so I think a lot of people look at what's happening in our day and try to see evidence of, well, what was happening in Noah's day, But I would say the reverse would also be true, that whatever is happening in our day was probably happening in Noah's day as well. And when I think about things like submarines and submersibles and, people in the Navy, for instance, spend extended periods of time under the ocean. And we also have achieved space travel. We've got people that have been up there in the International Space Station for decades now. That if that is happening in our day, and I believe that we are on the tail end of things. I think entropy after 6,000 years has led us to thinking we're so smart that we came from monkeys. But Adam being created in the image and likeness of God, I believe was significantly smarter just by default than we are today. Never mind the introduction of forbidden knowledge and stuff that the angels, the fallen ones, taught. That I think it's quite possible that the ancients achieved space travel as well as submersible technology. And do you think that, first of all, would you agree with that? And second of all, if that's true, do you think that's a plausible way to explain how giants returned after the flood? Because if they're underwater, well, the flood didn't affect them. And if they're out in space, the flood didn't affect them.
It does say that the Bible does say that the Rephaim live in the abyss, which is underneath the waters.
Right.
And they whirl around, which could literally mean refer to what we call USOs, submersible UFOs. My opinion is that the USOs are actually Rephaim flying around in their whirling discs. I think it's a passage in Job that talks about how the Rephaim whirl around underwater in the abyss. I think that's what they meant was they fly around in these whirling craft that they use to move around underwater, which have been spotted numerous times. So I think it's possible that some of the Rephaim may have survived underwater. Some of them may have survived in space. But everything that had the breath of life and it died, meaning everything that was on the earth and breathing, was killed. But it's possible some of them did survive. We don't know. I suspect there's a bit of a cover-up there because the Rephaim were just so dangerous that they had to be totally destroyed and memory erased. Because not only, like I said, the very fact that they exist indicates that mankind could be genetically modified by fallen angels. They had greater potential than God wanted to give them because given too much potential, mankind will become highly destructive and possibly mount an attack on heaven itself, which is what I think is Satan's ultimate goal for the giants, is to create an army to attack heaven and try to take the throne of God away from Jesus. And this is really what we're seeing in the Battle of Armageddon. This army of giants that Satan's been secretly rebreeding, giving them high technology and so forth, preparing them for this final battle against the Son of God to see who will actually rule the cosmos. And this just isn't God coming to sweep away evil armies. This is the final battle between the two great spirit beings in the universe to decide who will rule the universe from that point forward. And the part about the nations and about mankind and our cultures, that's only incidental. That's really what it's all about. And so when you keep that in mind, when we see the consolidation of the nations and what's going on with Egypt and Libya right now, where we're setting up a situation where we will be forced to conquer them, which, by the way, I believe will be the fulfillment. I think it's Daniel 9. The Antichrist will sweep through the Middle East and also Egypt, where he'll control the treasures of Egypt, and also Libya and Ethiopia, and the Sudan will be at his steps. I believe it'll be inevitable that we, in the next couple of years, perhaps in the next year, particularly because of the events of today where we've had people in our Libyan embassy killed, this will be a pretext for us to go into those countries and conquer them, particularly if the Muslim Brotherhood either A, tries to mount an attack on Israel, or B, tries to destroy some of the treasures of Egypt. Both of those will be unacceptable. And so we will be given a national and really a divine mandate to go in there, wipe out the Muslim Brotherhood, and take over those countries, thereby fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel.
Now, you made a statement a minute ago about the giants and being part of the Revelation 19:19 in the Valley of Megiddo, ready to make war with the one coming on the horse, which we know is Jesus. I've heard you on, I think it was on Zen Garcia's show, talking about the various giants that come from the lineage of Japheth. In my research, I've spent most of my time focused on the lineage of Ham and going through the various ites that the Israelites had to wipe out throughout the Old Testament. But talk a little bit more about the giants that come out of Japheth's lineage. Specifically, I want to know what your thoughts are on Gog and Magog, because when you said that, I've been on a track myself. I was a missionary for 6.5 years, traveled to about 15 countries during that time, and got to do a lot of cool stuff. And one of the things I was able to do was go to the Great Wall of China. And standing on the Great Wall of China and learning about it and everything, I came to find out that the Great Wall of China was originally known as the Rampart of Magog.
Right.
And as I started looking into Gog and Magog in folklore, in legend, I found that even to this day, there's the Lord Mayor Parade every year in the UK, where they march these two huge giants through the parade, and they're named Gog and Magog. So it appears to me that Gog and Magog are giants out of Japheth's line. And is that what you think is happening in Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog? And just kind of walk us through your thoughts on Gog and Magog and the descendants of Japheth as it relates to giants.
Okay. That's a very good question. Gog and Magog are the most powerful and deadly of all the giants. Gog and Magog are, in my opinion, Gomer and Magog, the two eldest sons of Japheth, the son of Noah. Now, the sons of Japheth populated what is known as the northern hemisphere, primarily Europe and Asia, parts of Asia. They originated out of the Caucasus Mountains, of course, where nearby where the Noah's Ark landed. The Caucasus Mountains are, of course, where we get the term Caucasians, and Gog and Magog are the penultimate Caucasians. Gog and Magog, I believe, were also, even though I can't prove it, I think they were also twins. I suspect Gog was possibly born just before Magog, and the two have always been struggling for supremacy of the North ever since. Now, Magog stayed in the East and became known as the Russians and also as the Irish and some of the Italians and some of the French. And but the descendants of Gomer, or Gog, came primarily the Germans. Which the German comes from the word Gomerian, the descendants of Gomer. So the Gomerians are the Germans are the descendants of Gomer. And the Magogians, the primary descendants of the Magogians are actually the Russians. So you have this ancient rivalry between these two factions, which manifests itself violently occasionally. This is particularly true in World War II, where these two were basically fighting over control of the entire northern hemisphere, or at least everything from between China and the Netherlands. And this happens occasionally. And so my theory is that Gomer is kind of the prince of the West, and he is the one through whom the two chief demons, Azazel, there are two chief demons, Azazel and Semyaza, as described in the book of Enoch. Azazel is actually the biblical Satan, and Semyaza is kind of a lesser lieutenant. And both of them use these two beings to struggle for control, because they're kind of enemies too. even though they're both in cooperation in their war against God, they're also rivals. My theory is that the Gomerians are controlled by Azazel, and the Megagians are controlled by Semyaza. And these two form the kind of the east-west paradigm that we see in the book, in the Gog and Magog kind of polarity of the east and west. And I came to this conclusion based on the fact that in the Revelation, I think it's 22, the war of Gog and Magog, the final one after the millennium, the Gog and Magog are not described as beings or peoples, they're described as directions. The peoples of Gog and Magog, or all the peoples of the earth are described as coming from the four winds, from Gog and Magog. And Gog and Magog, Gog has historically ruled the west, and Magog has historically ruled the east, and these are the kind of the two major worldviews, the Eastern and Western mindset. The Western mindset is being that of like the Greek mindset of the individual against the mass, and the Megagian mindset is that kind of the Asian worldview of the mass is more important than the individual. So out of that grew democracy in the West, where the individual rights are trumped out of the group. And the East you have is kind of communistic principle, where the group is more important than the individual. And this has been the polarity that has grown up over the last few thousand years, which will come to a catastrophic war right before the second coming of Christ. There will be a war of Gog and Magog, where the Western and the Eastern powers, this is what Jesus was talking about, kingdom versus kingdom. It's not just nations, this is actual ideologies are coming to a final clash to see which one will rule the earth, and the West will defeat the East and take control of the entire world for times and half a time. So the first 3.5 years of the tribulation is a war between the Eastern and Western power, between Azazel and Semyaz, in my opinion, to see who ends up controlling the entire world. And then, once it's determined that the West will defeat the East and control the world, at least nominally, then the world will be united as one against the second coming. So that is kind of the war of Gog and Magog. The people literally means the peoples of the West and the East, respectively, and after the millennium, coming together to fight against the people of Jerusalem. But the Gog and Magog war of Ezekiel is a little bit different. Gog of the land of Magog literally means in that context a German who rules over the Russians. Now, this is interesting because Vladimir Putin actually appears to be German in ancestry. His parents, his household, they spoke German when he grew up. He was not born into a Russian household. He was born into a German household. So though it's not explicitly stated in his biography, people believe he was actually German. Probably one of a group of families that moved to Germany under Empress Catherine the Great to serve as artisans and craftsmen, and to serve to teach the Russian laborers and craftsmen how to do quality craftsmanship. And it's believed that Putin is probably descended from all his family, and as such, as the kind of the effective dictator of Russia, as a German, he fits perfectly the description of Gog of the land of Magog. Because Gog of the land of Magog is a contradiction. Gog should not be in the land of Magog. According to actual history, they're historical enemies. But a German ruler, a Gomerian ruler in Russia, is an unusual situation. So when you see a German ruler ruling over Russia, you know that the war of Gog and Magog is imminent. And that's why I feel, it's one of the many reasons I feel that the end times is upon us, because Putin fits the description of a German ruler over the land of Russia perfectly.
Wow, that's pretty fascinating stuff. I never really thought about that. What about like the legends of like the Kyrgyz and what is it, Scythians or Scythians or something like that? Are we talking about giants there too?
The Kyrgyz were an ancient tribal people known for their mound building. They were giants, and they loved riding horses and chariots, and they were a conquering people who came out of the Russian steppe. I think it was 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. I forget exactly where they came from, but when they came out. But they're one of the earlier waves of giants, and they may have been related to, or have been, the Hyksos people who invaded Egypt, actually, who came out of waves out of the north, pushing from the north and possibly hooking up with the Philistine peoples and joining up with them to conquer various regions around the Mediterranean, including Egypt and also Canaan, where a later wave of giants showed up as the Philistines, where Goliath made his appearance. That was a wave of Philistines who were probably matched up with Scythian and or Gomerian giants coming out of the north, pushing out of the north as they often do. There have been, in history, waves of giant peoples emanating out of the Caucasus and southern Russia, the Ukraine, and the vast steppelands of Russia. The most recent wave being they were pushed west by the Mongols, but that was a later thing. The Scythians are actually a giant race, or more specifically a race of horse archers that were ruled over by giants. And they were very well known for their horsemen, their skill on horseback. The term parting shot actually comes from their style of archery, where they would charge towards their opponents and then turn away at the last minute and shoot over their backs, of the backs of their horses, as sort of a parting shot. And that the Parthians later picked up that concept and that technique. That's where we get the term parting shot. And the Scythians were ruled over by a tribe of giants. This is actually described in the Irish Annals. In my book, Mysterious World Ireland, I studied the people known as the Tuatha De Danann and Nephilim. They were the descendants of Scythian giants who migrated west over the Mediterranean all the way to Ireland to find a new land to escape the heavy taxation of their overlords in Central Asia. And these Tuatha De Danann in their history are actually described as going through Palestine and fighting against the Assyrians and against the Philistines on their way through. And they actually, some people believe they actually intermarried with and brought with them the tribe of Dan, which is why the tribe of Dan mysteriously disappeared, and why this Tuatha, which means tribe, took on the name of Danu, which was the tribe of Dan's name, thus becoming the Tuatha De Danann, or the tribe of Danu. And they migrated all the way west, and eventually made it to Ireland, where they ruled over the southern portion of Ireland. The Kennedys, for example, were Tuatha De Danann. John F. Kennedy was a descendant of the Tuatha, so he was an example of a descendant of those people. So they lived in Ireland to this day, and many of the great Irish kings, like I think Brian Boru was also a Tuatha De Danann descendant. Everyone in the South basically was, and most people were. But the Scythians were basically a race of giants who ruled over a mass of lesser people who served as their servants. The old Irish tale was giants were the lords, and normal people, their husbandmen. They were a race of royal class of giants who ruled over a mass of normal Homo sapiens who served as their servants. And that's just yet another example of actual giants in history that has just been accepted all this time as part of the folklore, as truth. And the ancient Irish priests said, well, there were giants in the earth, giants in the Bible, and there were giants in Ireland too, just like it says in the book. They routinely, even Irish priests, Christian priests, routinely equated the giants of Ireland with the giants of Canaan as being of the same stock, descended from the fallen angels. There was never any doubt in their minds. Only with the 20th century and the advent of secular humanism and scientific worldview, which pushes the idea that anything supernatural is bunk, and the idea of any kind of intermarriage between divine beings and human women is impossible, because divine beings don't exist. So only that has progressively eroded the belief in the giants and belief in the fallen angels, belief in the supernatural. And this is to get back to one of your original questions, why do you do Mysterious World? One of my objectives with Mysterious World was to reinvigorate the original biblical concepts that these things really happen, that the giants really exist, that the fallen angels really exist, that all of these things actually happen, and the Bible can be literally interpreted in these cases as the fallen angels literally came down and interacted with human beings, not just in Canaan, but all over the world, and created a giant race from which they used to rule the world. That was the concept. Liberal critical scholarship coming out of Germany, ironically, washed away a lot of these concepts. It's caused an enormous amount of damage. So I've been fighting against it in a passive way, fighting against that liberalization, that quiet liberalization, the creeping liberalization, which you see in translations such as the NIV, where they eliminate the word giants, they eliminate the word dragon. I think they replaced the term giants with Nephilim. They take all of these quote-unquote mythological things out of there, which is absolutely the wrong direction, and it's playing right in the hand of the secularists, which would love nothing more than destroy Christianity. So it makes no sense at all for us to try to share a bed with the secular humanists, the very people who are trying to destroy the Bible and destroy Christianity and relegate it to the past. I refuse to let it happen, so I decided to use Mysterious World as an attempt, fairly successfully actually, to reinvigorate the concept that these things actually happened.
Yeah, no, I was just, while you were talking, I was looking at on your Mysterious World website on the Scythians, and you've got quite a bit on here. Is this your entire book on the Giants of Ireland? Is that complete?
Yeah, there's a section on giants in my book, Mysterious World Ireland, and there's actually a journal article, a free journal article called Giants of Ireland. It's available at www.mysteriousworld.com. And that talks specifically about the Irish giants and how they were ubiquitous in ancient Near East or ancient Irish history, very very common. That's out of the central major mythologies of Ireland and the histories, and how they emanated from the lands of Magog, which are in southern Russia, Ukraine, and far parts of China actually. And how they migrated out of those areas. They actually conquered in all directions, north, south, east, and west, which is just the way they operated. They attacked on all fronts, and that's why you have in Pakistan and northern India, you have blue-eyed, taller people, because that's where they were intermarrying with the giants. Same thing with Afghanistan, the blue-eyed Afghani girl, which was so famous in the 1970s in that National Geographic cover. And Iran literally means Aryan. That's the descendants of the Aryan giants who emanated from Central Asia. They consider themselves to be different from Arabs because they were partly descended from the giants. And of course they went west into Germany and so Eastern Europe, where you have a lot of blonde, tall people. And they went via the Mediterranean all the way to Ireland, where they had a lot of tall people and a lot of giants in their history. So all you have to do is follow the history and follow the legends and follow what people actually believed. That's all I do. I just say this is what they believed. It corresponds to the Bible. I believe in the Bible, therefore what they believe is probably true, or possibly true also, because it correlates with actual biblical description and written history by credible historians.
Now, I've got two questions that come to my mind listening to what you're saying, and then we're going to start transitioning into the Planet X and gap theory and all that stuff for the second hour. But I just really, while I had you on the phone, I really want to talk to you about the giant stuff because I'm so fascinated by it. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of my research is centered around the offspring of Ham and the giants that came through his lineage. But it appears that from what I'm hearing and from what I'm seeing on your website, most of yours traces giants from Japheth. Have you found giants in Shem's lineage as well?
Shem, no, not at all. The first part of our four-part series on the giants talks about the descendants of the giants that came from Canaan, the son of the grandson of Ham, actually. Because of the actions of Ham in the world after the flood, after Noah became drunk in his tent, he cursed Canaan, not Ham. He cursed Canaan. Right. And it's from Canaan came the giants of the ancient Near East, those who were interacting with the Nephilim, or the fallen angels once again, from whom were being born the giants of that area. But the Japhethites are also doing that, and it's possible. And there are actually historical records of giant incursions from the north coming in into Canaan. It's possible that the Canaanites actually interbred with the Germani and Scythian giants, and that's where the giants came from. Or it can be that they came directly from interaction with fallen angels. It's not really clear. But there are major intrusions of northern peoples into the Canaanite area. There was a major city called Scythopolis, for example, where the Scythians controlled that area. And of course, you have the giant's ring on the top of the stone circle, the Gilgal Rephaim, on top of the Golan Heights. That's a classic example of a giant construction, the kind you'd find that the Kurgans would have made, the kind very similar actually to Stonehenge in its construction. You have all kinds of kind of dolmens and similar stone constructions in Israel, the same that you would find in all over Ireland, the same kind of situation. So it's possible that the Canaanite giants were actually intermarriages between northern giants who came down, Scythian giants, Gomerian giants, interbred with them and formed ruling classes over them. That's possibly who the Amorites were. As a rule, I suspect they were, and I've read this before, that they were a tribe of Germanic giants who conquered the ancient Near East and formed dynastic rulerships over these areas. The Amorite dynasty of Babylon, for example, something might have been a Germanic family. That was Hammurabi came from that family. The dynasties of the Amorites who conquered Canaan. The Canaanites were actually conquered by the Amorites, so it's possible that the Amorites were a mixed breed of northern barbarians, of Scythians, or Germanic types, who had bred with maybe Hittites or other Canaanites, and formed a dynasty known as the Amorites, which formed a ruling class over the rest of the Canaanites. It's possible that they weren't actually offspring of fallen angels and human women, and that they may have been ruled over by an Amorite dynasty from the north. That's one of my theories, is that the Amorites were were actually descendants of Japheth, at least partly.
Yeah, I've got a different take on the Amorites. We should exchange notes sometime after this is over. I'm actually writing my second book, and it deals quite a bit with the issue of the Amorites. Josephus and others track the Amorites directly back to Amorius, son of Ham, one of the offspring of Ham. But it begs the question, whether that's true or not. What we're talking about is, there's an awful lot of giants out there, not too long after the flood, spreading all over the new dried earth after the flood. So it begs the question, do we have Nephilim genetics in people today? I mean, do we, there's been an awful lot of intermarriages over the centuries, the last several thousand years. So would it be fair to say that people are walking around with dormant or active Nephilim genetics today?
It's possible that very tall people do. They have remnants of, in fact, I would say probably yes. They've been largely weeded out and spread out in terms of genetics, so they're no longer able to rise up, as it were. Like I said earlier, Hitler attempted to rebreed the giants through his Lebensraum and similar programs. The SS stormtroopers were basically hand-picked, tall, blonde men, for the most part, who were attempts to rebreed these giants and actually give, as part of the rituals, I suspect they were attempting to allow the fallen angels to inhabit these men. That was one of the major reasons they did that. They had all kinds of strange rituals, like they formed the candlelight procession, forming the swastika. That sort of thing was all intended to raise up these ancient fallen angels from hell and bring them back up and use them to inhabit these super soldiers they were trying to rebreed. So yes, I would say, generally speaking, they do exist. They're remnants of the giants genetically are spread out throughout humanity. I won't speculate as to where they are, but in answer to your question, I do believe the majority of mankind does have probably at least a little bit of giant in them.
Yeah, I would share that same belief, but I found that that's a very controversial viewpoint in some circles, anyway, because there are some people out there that believe that Nephilim cannot be saved. And now, I guess it depends on how you define Nephilim, whether they be fallen angels or the offspring of fallen angels or both. But my take on it is wherever the spirit of man is present and repentant, salvation is available. Regardless if you've got a couple of genetic markers left in you or not. My take is that if you have a truly repentant heart and you ask Jesus to be your Savior, who's to say you can't get saved?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I always think of Richard Keel, who was clearly a descendant of giants. He was the guy who played Jaws in the Bond films. And he's actually a pretty conservative Christian, right? Oh,
yeah? The guy who played Jaws?
Yeah, he's actually a Christian.
Really?
So you wouldn't expect that, because he's actually a very nice man and a Christian man.
Really?
He might still be alive, I'm not sure. But if he's a classic example of a giant. I mean, if there ever was a giant on Earth, it's that guy, him or Andre the Giant. And I feature him in my articles online, talking about him as an example of a modern-day descendant of giants, a classic example. And he was only about 7.5 feet tall, but he was enormous. You can imagine what an 8 or 9 feet tall giant would have been like.
Sure.
I have a picture of him in one of my articles where he's literally holding up Roger Moore like he was like he was a kid. And it was like his hand can cover his entire head. And he's not even, he wasn't even that big. He was only about 7.5 feet tall. But he was able to manhandle Roger Moore like he was just nothing.
Wow.
It was also, Roger Moore wasn't a small man either. So, but there are definitely giants out there. Keel is definitely a classic example of a descendant of a giant. Andre the Giant, another classic example. He was naturally strong, never had to work out. He was enormously powerful, very big man, very athletic man. He did suffer from problems with his pituitary, I think it was, or not pituitary, it was glandular dysfunction. But he was naturally strong. He wasn't just a glandular giant.
Okay. Well, we as we go into the second hour here, I want to transition now to talking about your book. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Douglas Elwell. He is the founder of Mysterious World. MysteriousWorld.com is his website. And we're going to talk about his book, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man, and the End of the Age. Doug, why don't you give your contact information and any other websites or places where people can get your book and check out your materials?
Sure. The best place to get it, let's see, But you can go online to Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. You can also go to Tom Horn's site, Raiders News. Let's see. Also, there's let's see, Planet X. The best place to go is actually planet-x.info, which will give you all the links you need to go to. The best place to go to buy it, I'd like to have you go to is survivalmall.com. That's survivormall.com. There's a link to it from planet-x.com. That way you get to help out Tom Horn and his ministry. And you can also get it from Amazon and Barnes & Noble, of course. Order through your local bookstore as well. There's both a print version and Kindle version available, too. And for Mysterious World, you can go to mysteriousworld.com. And if you wish to send me an email, you can send an email to publisher@mysteriousworld.com. Or you can look up Mysterious World on Facebook. And we have a Facebook page as well. Also a Planet X page.
Excellent. Well, speaking of Planet X, what is Planet X? How would you define Planet X? What is it?
Planet X is a mainstream astronomical concept derived in order to try to figure out some of the anomalies in our solar system. The original Planet X theory was derived by Percival Lowell in the late 1900s as the name of an unknown planet which they believed orbited beyond Neptune. Now, when they searched for Planet X, they used the conventional methods of blink comparison to see the difference between two different plates, two different images taken of photographs of the night sky. And they had a man named Clyde Tombaugh come in, a young astronomer, come in and go through tens of thousands of plates using what is called a blink comparator to see if he could find Planet X beyond the planet Neptune. Using this technique, which is basically showing two different images of the same piece of sky a few seconds apart, or possibly a few minutes apart, to see if there's any differences between the two. And if you see a difference, that image will contain an image of a planet because of that distance, because of parallax. Only a distant object, or only a planet in our solar system, or an object in our solar system would move because the background stars are, for all practical purposes, fixed because they're so far away. So using that technique, Clyde Tombaugh found the planet, what turned out to be the planet Pluto, I think around 1930, something like that. But it wasn't the Planet X they were looking for. So the Planet X theory kind of lingered for a while because they weren't able to find it using that technique. But when the Voyager spacecraft, the Voyager probes, passed Uranus and Neptune in the 1970s, they found both of these planets had been radically transformed by some sort of external force. The planet Uranus was actually spinning on its side, and it had formed a ring system after it had been turned on its side, which was kind of unusual, indicating that it had been disrupted by a very large object, a massive planet-sized object that had intruded into our solar system sometime in the solar system's past. Neptune was similarly messed up. Its rotation and magnetic axes were about 80 degrees off kilter. It was very strange. It had a moon, Neptune, which had a normal orbit, but also a moon called Nereid, which had an elliptical orbit, which was like a 9-to-1 ratio, which was really weird, which should not have happened, and another moon which orbited backwards. So, contrary to the other moons. So, when they did the mathematics, they determined the anomalies with Uranus and Neptune could only have occurred if there was an interaction with a planet-sized object and a planet intruding into our solar system. This planet is about 5 times the mass of Earth, and entering our solar system from the outside. And so that's what revived the Planet X theory, and there was a craze about searching for Planet X for the next couple of decades. It's tied down from there, but well into the 1980s and the early 1990s, there are all kinds of articles and research done on the search for Planet X. And my book, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age, chronicles the major research done on Planet X during that period. And they're still looking for it. They believe that it is possibly in the southern hemisphere, having an elliptical orbit, because, in order to have interacted with the solar system and yet be invisible, it would have to be have an orbit that is that precesses over time, and it actually shifts in its angle to the solar system. This explains why the comets orbit at an angle to the solar system. Comets, many people don't know, they have not only they have orbits that take them out of the solar system for very elliptical orbits, but they also have orbits, many of them, that are at an angle to the ecliptic. So they not only exit the solar system on the x-axis, but also on the y-axis. And the only way this could have happened is if an intruding object came in and brought them in. And this is where another reason for the Planet X theory is. Astronomers believe Planet X, or an object like Planet X, when it comes into our solar system, brings the comets in with it. And this is why we have comets that come in and out of our solar system, because there's no other way to describe, no other mechanism to describe how this could happen. There has to be an intrusive object coming in and out of our solar system. So the evidence for Planet X is, at this point, primarily the great eccentricities in the outer solar system, and also the existence of the comets. So the Planet X theory is actually a mainstream astronomical theory, which has been, widely held by a number of astronomers for over 100 years now. Now, when you talk about the Sitchin-esque approach, where you have Planet X as the featured character in the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic, you have to take the idea that the ancient Babylonians were actually aware of how the earth was created. And this is a bit of a stretch for some people, even people who believe in God, because it's a bit of a stretch. But if we were to take, when you have biblical passages which describe God's conflict with the dragon in the sea, in the context of the creation, in Psalm 74, and several times in Job, and also in some of the Psalms, you have Psalm 74 and also Job and Isaiah. You have a clear distinction, a clear description in the scriptures also of the earth being created as a result of a conflict between God and some sort of a dragon. And now in Enuma Elish, the dragon actually symbolized the earth. And it does also in the Bible, because though it's not specifically stated, it's clearly implied that as a result of this conflict, earth was created. Psalm 74, for example, says, "You defeated the dragon, you created the seasons and the times." As a result of the conflict, the earth's orbital period and axial tilt was somehow created as a result of this conflict. And I get into this in depth into my book, how Enuma Elish actually probably is a very detailed description of a conflict between Planet X and the Earth in ancient times, forming the Earth as we know it now. The Earth having originally formed in the fourth position from the Sun, not the third, explaining why there is a huge amount of rocky material out there in the form of the asteroid belt, which, if you put it all together, would form a very small body, maybe 1/10 the size of our moon. It's not nearly enough to form a planet. So scientists believe, astronomers believe that, not astronomers, but some of these fringe scientists and people like me who believe in the possibility of alternative theories like this, believe that the Earth was created as a result of, in its present form, was created as a result of the giant hit back between a satellite of Planet X and an intrusive body into our solar system and Earth. And this explains why you have in Genesis 1:1 not the word create, but the word cut, because the word for created in Genesis 1:1 is not the word for created, it's the word bara, which means to cut, literally to cut something into two pieces, to split it. And so when you have this description of the Earth being split into two pieces into heaven and earth, this matches perfectly with the description in Enuma Elish of how the Babylonian deity Marduk, whom I believe replaced God in the mythology of the Babylonians as the creator of heaven and earth. But the mythology of the Babylonians still retains the basic understanding. They believe that Marduk, or Planet X, took one of its satellites and used it to split Earth into two pieces. And this is the description of the splitting off the asteroid belt from the Earth. And it also describes in Enuma Elish how Marduk took another one of these winds or satellites and moved the Earth into a new position. It literally says that the head of Tiamat was used to form the Earth, and it was moved from its original position. I believe that the book of Genesis, chapter 1, describes this also when it says, the spirit or wind of God hovered over the waters. Literally means that that passage literally says that the wind of God hovered over the waters in order to warm them. And the process of warming, the term is described of a hen or a female bird warming the eggs. And the Earth is kind of thought of as an egg being warmed by say a hen or a female bird. And what a female bird does to warm the eggs, well, not only does she sit on them, she rolls them. So that the idea, I think, that Genesis was, in parallel to the Enuma Elish, was that the Earth was rolled into a new position closer to the sun where it would be warmer. That's the concept. The Holy Spirit acted like a mother hen, this divine wind, rolling the Earth into a position where it would be warmer. That's why Moses used the metaphor of a mother hen warming the eggs, of rolling the Earth to a new place closer to the sun where it would be warm enough to sustain life. And that's just one of many parallels I found in Genesis and in the Psalms and Isaiah with the Enuma Elish and the Bible. I was totally convinced by that to the point where I felt it was justified to write this book, and quite frankly, formed possibly a revolution in our understanding of the creation.
Okay, while you were talking, I was reminded of something I had read a long time ago, so I was looking through my library to find it. It was the book Worlds in Collision by Immanuel Velikovsky. And on page 11, he talks about since the time of Laplace is one of the theories for the formation, he created one of the theories for the formation of the solar system. Basically, the sun at one point, while the gases were combining to make the sun, pieces were flying off and eventually cooled and whatnot in the solar system. And he points out that if that's true, then everything should be rotating in the same direction and the same angular momentum as the sun, if everything flew off the sun that way. And he says,
it's called the nebular hypothesis.
Yeah, the nebular hypothesis. He talks about that next to the tidal theory. But he says right here, since the time of Laplace, new members of the solar system have been discovered. Now we know that though the majority of the satellites revolve in the same direction as the planets revolve and the sun rotates, the moons of Uranus revolve in a plane almost perpendicular to the orbital plane of their planet, and 3 of the 11 moons of Jupiter, 1 of the 9 moons of Saturn, and 1 of the moons of Neptune revolve retrogradely. These facts contradict the main argument of the Laplace theory. A rotating nebula could not produce satellites revolving in 2 different directions. So what you're describing, and actually, if I remember right, this has been a long time since I read this book, Velikovsky, I believe, thought it was Venus coming through the solar system, and then eventually settling where Venus is now, that caused a lot of stuff that you attribute to Planet X.
I would just flush Velikovsky. He's not any good.
What's that?
I would ignore Velikovsky. I've read it. It just wasn't any good.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book, but you keep talking about the Enuma Elish. That's explain what that is to my listeners. This is the Babylonian creation epic, correct?
Yeah, Enuma Elish is the Babylonian account of the creation. It describes, instead of kind of a static, more of a scientific approach to the creation, where the sun and moon and planets are all, and stars are all these inanimate objects, which was unusual for the ancient Near East, and actually a very scientific approach. Because in the ancient world, the sun, moon, and planets were considered to be deities that had taken a physical form or were manifesting physical attributes. And this is how it was in Enuma Elish. They were all the sun and moon and planets, according to the Sitchin hypothesis, and my belief, and also what must have been the original concept of the Sumerians, because in a creation epic, the gods of the Sumerians were the sun, moon, and planets. They wouldn't have been the earth, and they wouldn't have been like mud and rocks and the seas and the oceans like secular mythologists want us to believe. They worship the planets as the gods. So in the Sitchin's hypothesis, which I believe is the correct one, they worship the planets and the sun and the moon, which were featured in their creation story as the main characters, given names. And Earth, for example, is named Tiamat, which was a dragon goddess who was closely associated with water, which is a perfect description of the Earth, which has ever since then in various mythologies been described as a dragon. But then they say all these other things are not the other planets, even though the Sumerians' worship of the planets was at the center of their cosmology. So I take it literally that this Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the formation of the planets from the nebula disk. It actually talks about how the major god of their deity, Apsu, which Sitchin describes as the sun, brought forth all these other deities from this, what is described as kind of a disk, or kind of a halo, which is like a disk. And all the gods of the Sumerians were born from this halo of this deity Apsu. And it's actually an excellent description of how the planets are formed, because they're also, we can say definitively that's how the planets were formed, because we can see other solar systems in formation where that very thing is happening. It's exactly the same. So Laplace's theory is not really a theory anymore. It's kind of pretty much a fact, because we can observe it in process in other solar systems forming. So we know for sure that's how our solar system formed, or in a very similar way. So we can say for sure that that's how it happened. So my theory is that the Genesis 1:1 does not describe the creation of the Earth, but actually a modification of the Earth, so it exists in its present form. The creation of the universe by God was not necessary to be described. It was, it was obvious. It was obvious. Really, just the first only 2 or 3 chapters of the book of Genesis are dedicated to any creation at all. The remaining 47 talk about the history of mankind, specifically the descendants of Abraham. So there was very little emphasis placed on creation in the Old Testament. So I don't think he intended to talk about anything about the creation except for the creation of the earth in its current form. It's possible that the earth was inhabited by previous beings even that were so wicked that it had to be wiped out. So it's possible that the Bible is written in such a way that all memory of everything prior to this giant impact and interaction with Planet X, everything is wiped out, meant to be forgotten forever, and not even mentioned in the Bible. So that's probably why they wrote it in the way they did. And the idea of this theme in the ancient Near East of the Earth being divided into two pieces by kind of an intruding planet was so ubiquitous in the ancient Near East, and so such a common concept. I don't think Moses even conceived the possibility that people would forget about it and kind of diverge into these various theories which don't take this into account anymore. Everyone, I mean, literally everyone thought of the creation as the result of a conflict between a divine being and a dragon. Everyone all around the Israelites, all the countries they lived in, all the countries they came from, all the surrounding countries had some version of this myth. So it was absolutely ubiquitous, and it's easy for me to make this argument because that's what the Hebrews believed. It's absolutely a rock-solid certainty.
Right. And I think the point that Velikovsky was making is that even Laplace theory everything should be spinning in the right direction, but clearly something came through our solar system and tipped the planets over and made things spin opposite ways and really perturbed things.
Yes.
And so to your point, you believe that that's Planet X, and to the point of the gap theory, this is something that always intrigued me. Like I said, I just kind of always held it at arm's length, but literally in the last, I want to say 2 to 3 weeks, I've become almost obsessed with this because it keeps coming at me. It came at me from Zen Garcia right after I interviewed him. I found your book as part of the collection that I got from David Flynn. And then a publisher who was looking at my first book, Babylon Rising and the First Shall Be Last, sent me a book that his father wrote in 1997 called A Conspiracy of Angels, and I start reading his book, and he's talking about it too. And then I surf over to Canary Cry Radio, and Basil and Gons, the two hosts of that show, we're talking about it too. And I'm like, okay, something's going on, because literally, like, in a 1 week's period of time, it seemed like everybody in the world was on this subject. So I'm like, well, I'm going to have to get into it myself. And I'm really intrigued by it because when you look at Genesis 1:1, or 1:2, I should say, and the earth was without form and void, tohu vavohu in Hebrew, we have to contend with Isaiah 45:18, where Isaiah says that God did not create the world, it says in vain in King James, but it's the same word, tohu, without form. So either there's a contradiction or there's another way of looking at it, and the gap theory seems to explain it, that in the beginning God created it not tohu, but then it became tohu. It got messed up somehow, and from what I'm hearing from you and what I'm reading in some of these other guys' writings, it got messed up big time. I mean, if it was knocked out of an orbit that was previously between Mars and Jupiter and is now where it is today, that's a pretty significant event. And
right.
You talk about, you mentioned it earlier, the war of God versus the dragon. Walk us through that.
The dominant paradigm of the ancient Near East, of the creation paradigm, was that the earth was created in its present form. It previously existed, but in its present form, it was substantially modified as a result of a conflict between a divine being in heaven, who was symbolized by a star, and the planet Earth. This is true in the Mesopotamia myths, the Canaanite myths, Greco-Roman myths, later Egyptian myths have allusions to it. And the Hittites also, the myth of, I think it's Helioncus, talks about a dragon and a creation. They all talked about this concept. It was ubiquitous. And it was all about the dragon being divided in half, one half of being used to create heaven, and one half being used to create earth. Now there's 3 different heavens in the scriptures. One that is the earth's atmosphere, one that is somewhere in space, and one, the third heaven, that is where God lives. My theory is that the first heaven is indeed the atmosphere where the birds fly. But the second heaven is actually the asteroid belt, because that forms a distinct division between the inner planets and the outer planets. And it also is described several times in the Bible. Heaven is actually literally described as a place where rocks are stored. The heavenly armories, I think it's called in the King James, or something like that, the munitions of rocks. That is a perfect description of the asteroid belt. In that sense, heaven, the part of the earth that was split off as a result of the divine conflict, part of it was left in space, and that would have been, in that kind of a conflict scenario, that would have been a bunch of rocks flowing through space, which is exactly what the asteroid belt is. So you have this dragon, quote-unquote, which is a metaphor for the earth, being split in two, one part being created to heaven, which is the asteroid belt, and the other part earth. Its head moved further, closer to the sun, it will be warmer. It's given a certain rotation rate and axial tilt, and also a moon, which scientists are definitive in their belief, uniform in their belief, was actually created as a result of a giant impact. Perhaps you've heard the giant impact theory. Around 1980, after the various theories on how the moon was formed were brought forward and found to be unsatisfying, such as the fission theory, as in the moon just comes out of the Earth for no reason. The idea that it was spun off Earth, which rotated very rapidly. And I think at least one of the major theory, it was determined that the only way that the moon could have been formed, based on the Apollo moon lander data and other measurements, was if it had been created as a result of a collision between an object roughly the size and mass of Earth, not roughly the size and mass of Mars, not the planet Mars itself, but an object about that size, which embedded itself in Earth and ejected a similar amount of mantle material into space where it cooled and solidified into the moon. That is called the giant impact theory. And my theory about Planet X is basically a combination of the mainstream astronomical Planet X theory plus the giant impact theory, modified by Sitchin's ideas, so that the Planet X was an impact, one of its satellites, impacted into Earth, embedding itself into the Earth like an arrow into the heart of the dragon. And part of the ejecta was pushed out, which later formed the moon. And this explains why, just after Tiamat is divided into two in Enuma Elish, we have a description of the creation of the moon, because that's what happened after the giant impact. Heaven and Earth were divided into two, as the asteroid blood in the Earth. Earth was moved, and the moon was also formed, all by the same series of events. Also, the seas were formed, because not many people know this, but the Earth's oceans were actually formed as a result of what scientists believe to be multiple meteoric strikes against the Earth, which released waters from the mantle. Most of the water on Earth, in Earth right now, is actually in the mantle, chemically bonded with what are called water-bearing minerals, hydrous minerals, such as serpentine and talc, which have water as part of their molecular structure. And when they're placed under pressure, they release this water, and it shoots up into the sky. And this is probably where the fountains of the deep came from. Probably meteorites were striking the Earth during Noah's time and causing these fountains to shoot up and help flood the Earth. But the giant impact would have converted a large amount of the mantle into pretty much pure water, much of which would have gone into space, where it bound with the asteroids, which explains why the asteroids we're now finding have a large amount of water as part of their structure, which would be impossible otherwise, if not for the giant impact theory as I propose it. And also, much, if not most of the water fell back to Earth, forming Earth's oceans. There's no other mechanism to describe that massive amount of water just forming. It would have to be released chemically from the minerals by a huge amount of pressure from the Earth's mantle. So the giant impact theory also explains how the Earth's oceans could be created. It also explains how the comets could be created, because the comets are essentially, basically asteroids with a large amount of water on their surface. So that much water ice would not have been part of asteroids unless it had been much chemical released on a large scale. And even in Enuma Elish, they're described as growling demons, which fought on Tiamat's side, whose bodies were filled with water. Their radiance was very great and filled the heavens with a tremendous halo. An object in space filled with water, a tremendous halo, is a perfect description of the comets. So in Enuma Elish, you actually have a description of the creation of the comets, which would be explained by the giant impact event also. It all fits so perfectly, it's just point for point for point. All the anomalies of the solar system are explained by this end of the creation, are explained by this single paradigmatic conflict between God and the dragon, which forms the foundation of the concept of the Bible throughout the Old Testament and even through the New Testament in the book of Revelation, where you have this verification of the conflict between God and the dragon once more. As it was in the beginning, so will be in the end. Urzeit und Endzeit, beginning and end, as described by Homan Gunkel in his book on the subject, a famous German theologian who promoted this hypothesis that, I think it was in the early 1900s, that the mythology of the Mesopotamians was cognate with that of the God versus dragon material to be found in the Bible, so close as to have a common source. And that common source was probably from Abraham, and who came out of the Sumerian Empire right before it collapsed, and from whose traditions of the creation of the Bible were eventually written down, and that's why we have descriptions of the dragon conflicted with God and the creation of the earth, because they were from ancient times.
Now, I was looking through the scriptures the other day when I was first being introduced to this, or reintroduced to this topic, and the thought occurred to me that, we all know from the book of Revelation that there's going to be a redo. After the millennial reign of Christ, God's going to recreate the heaven and the earth. So, and we always think of God as being eternal, but I think most of us think we project that eternal future. We neglect to realize that, well, he's eternal the other way too. He goes back eternally just as much as he goes forward eternally. So, what was he doing for eternity prior to, say, 6,000 years ago, if you believe that? The earth is only that old now. If we can wrap our minds around the fact that there's going to be a redo at the end of the millennial reign of Christ, why is it hard to believe that we could be living in a redo right now?
It's not. I mean, my theory is that Planet X comes around every either 1 or 2,000 years to inaugurate new eras of mankind. My theory is it's every roughly 2,000 years. My theory is that because of a close interaction possibly between Planet X and Jupiter, or one or more of the other planets, Planet X will actually come very close to Earth this time. Normally it only comes as close to the asteroid belt. The last time it appeared around 2,000 years ago was as the Star of Bethlehem, which inaugurated the birth of Christ. My theory is that one of my original motivations for studying this topic was to figure out what was the Star of Bethlehem. And when I had exhausted all the theories regarding the Star of Bethlehem, I realized, I came across Stitchin's book on Planet X, and I realized I never heard of Planet X. This is just a sort of bizarre anomaly that would fit the Star of Bethlehem phenomenon perfectly. And I followed that track ever since, with the theory that the astral sign that preceded his first coming will be the same that precedes his second coming. And why have two different signs? Why have the same sign for the same person? So my theory is that the Planet X has an orbital period of 2,000 years, but some sort of interaction with one of the outer planets will bring it close to the Earth. To explain many of the descriptions of, for example, Matthew 24, when the powers of the heavens are shaken, that literally means in the Greek concept that the planets themselves will be moved in their orbits, because that's the powers is a description of the deities of heaven, which are the planets. And also the description of the trumpets. And my interview with Zen, actually I went into depth about how the wormwood is actually probably a bit of the original Earth, which had become ground down and kind of flash frozen in space. And this is kind of this concentrated powdered plant life as part of a meteor, asteroid, or comet that passed through Earth's atmosphere might sprinkle a lot of this stuff back into Earth's atmosphere in a concentrated form, poisoning Earth's waters and with ancient wormwood, which was actually a real plant, which was hallucinogenic in nature. So this was like a poisoning and drugging the American, Freudian slip, the people of the world at that time, at the time of the end. And a lot of the descriptions of the end times judgments are related, in my opinion, to Planet X, specifically to meteorites and asteroids and comets being cast down on Earth by Planet X's gravitational pull, possibly from planet that were traveling in Planet X's orbit and its train and its orbit throughout the solar system preceding in its orbit. I even talk in the chapter 6 about the book of Job. It was actually a description of the return of Planet X around Job's time, which was around 2000 BC, how it passed through the solar system at that time and threw a lot of asteroids down on Earth, causing the destruction of Sumer, which occurred around that time, and also the catastrophe which befell Job. And in my opinion, Job was really a description of kind of a collation of all the Planet X material, oral traditions, and that so forth, in place at that time around the story of a man who was affected by a meteorite that struck southern Iraq around that time. I talk about that in chapter 6. And I forget the original train of thought. I'm getting off on a different track, but basically the paradigm is the God versus dragon, is that of God himself coming in and attacking Earth using this planet, using it to judge this planet. And this will happen again in the end times when Planet X returns, passes near Earth, showers us with asteroids, and when it comes on its near flyby, the destruction will be so great that all the cities will fall down, all the civilizations will be destroyed, and all the armies of the Earth will be wiped out by the passing of this planet. The lightning that passes between the planets will literally incinerate the entire army of the beast, and then Jesus will come down and claim the Earth and take control of it for 1,000 years. After which time Planet X returns again, because its orbit will have been shortened by its orbit will have been modified by this interaction with Earth. It'll come back again after 1,000 years, and the fire that falls on the armies of Gog and Magog will be the same thing. Once again, Planet X passes near Earth, lightning passes between the planets and fries the armies that are arrayed against the people of God. It happens again. It's the same pattern over and over again. God sends Planet X to defeat his enemies and save his people. That's the paradigm of the way he operates throughout history. Even when Planet X didn't come close, it signaled the advent of one who would save his people. In this case, Planet X heralded 2,000 years ago the birth of Christ, and returns again. It'll herald his second coming, at which time the Planet X itself will return with Jesus, and Jesus will use it as his primary weapon to defeat the forces of Satan.
So then, with this 2,000-year interaction with Earth, you'd have the creation account happening roughly 4,000 BC. 2,000 years later, about the time of Abram being born, the time of Job, you think, would be the next interaction. And then the next time would be the appearing in the sky to herald the birth of Jesus. And then the coming one will be at the time of the Battle of Armageddon. And then the final one will recreate the heaven and earth just like it did the first time at the end of the millennial reign. Would that summarize what your theory is?
Yes, that summarizes it pretty well. Except for the final return will actually be a final conflict between Planet X and Earth, which Earth will lose, and it'll be thrown into the sun. And the new Earth is not actually a revived Earth, it is actually Planet X, which will take Earth's place in its orbit around the sun. This planet being specifically designed to replace Earth in just the way that Jesus will replace Satan as the ruler of God's people. It's a parallel. Jesus has his own planet, and Satan has this one. Both Satan and all his works and everything in the earth will be burnt up forever by fire, just as it said in, I think it's Thessalonians, I forget the exact phrase. The earth and all its works will be burned up forever. So comfort yourselves with these words. Even though it seems like the wicked prosper now, they and everything they built will be totally destroyed and thrown into the sun. It'll be forgotten. Not only will it be destroyed, it'll be forgotten, as if it never existed. And a new planet will be created specifically for the chosen of God, whom Jesus himself selected to live in this planet. And that is the planet on which the New Jerusalem will land. You would never bring down the New Jerusalem onto the earth. It's just too corrupt. Too much wickedness, too much bad history. So not only will we have a New Jerusalem, a new city to live in, you'll have a new planet to put it on.
Well, that's interesting. So do you believe that Planet X and Nibiru are one and the same?
Yeah.
Okay. So
it's exactly the same planet, different name for the same planet.
Okay. So then, if I'm hearing you right, do you believe that God is that I don't want to sound like a Mormon or something here, but do you think that God is riding Nibiru, or what is your?
I don't know if he lives on it. The planet will be extremely cold and dark. The theory, part of the theory is that just as Jesus says, behold, I approach like a thief in the night. Planet X, like most comets, is actually covered or enclouded with a huge amount of dark, black organic material that is literally darker than coal. Most people don't know this, but most comets are covered with this dark, cold, black organic material, which makes them invisible to the naked eye until their tail forms when they come close to the sun. That is what I believe Jesus meant when he says, behold, I come like a thief in the night. Planet X will not become visible to the naked eye until its tail forms, because it has a tail like a comet, a really big tail. But before that time, it's pretty much invisible to all but the most advanced astronomical telescopes. No one on Earth who doesn't have like an infrared advanced telescope will be able to detect it. But I don't think he's riding it. I think he's using it like a heavenly mace, as described in Revelation 2 when he says, I inherit I will smash my enemies like a broken vessel, like a clay pot with a mace. I believe the mace he's referring to is Planet X, which is his primary weapon. He will use it just as he did in the beginning to divide heaven and earth and create a new earth from the old version, which may have been full of corruption and satanic machinations. Nobody knows what happened with the old earth. But this new earth, he destroyed the old earth and created a new one by using this planet as kind of a mace to smash it. And he says in Revelation 2, right before he says, behold, I am the bright morning star, he then talks about this mace, which he'll use to smash earth. So I believe the corollary there is he's saying, I will appear, if not actually riding it, I will send Planet X to destroy my enemies in the end times. And it says in Revelation 2, those who overcome, I will give him the morning star. What he is saying there is, you will get to live here in this new planet I'm creating specifically for you. And the old earth and all the corruption in it and all the bad things that happened and it will be thrown down and destroyed, and all the works in it burned up and forgotten.
I always
So
wonder
says,
about that
actually,
that scripture where it says, "I'll give you the morning star." So you're saying that the inheritance is the new earth will be what was formerly the hammer of God, basically, that destroys this one?
Yes, yes. I'll read out the passage for you. It's Revelation 2:27 through 28. He shall rule them with a rod of iron, and they shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels. As I also have received from my Father, and I'll give him the morning star. Actually, the morning star, there's actually a weapon called the morning star, which is basically a mace. That was one of the appellations for a mace during the times of the the nightly orders. It was also called a morning star. After this passage, they said they would strike their enemies with the morning star, literally the description of this mace that Jesus was going to use to destroy the earth and cast it down forever. It occurs a couple of different places. I think maybe Revelation 1 also. This idea of a morning star and the destruction of Jesus' enemies.
But doesn't Jesus call himself? Isn't Jesus referred to as the morning star himself, though?
Yes, he is referred to as the morning star, but I don't think he is the planet. It is his heavenly sign and his inheritance.
So that's why you call it the sign of the Son of Man. Because I always wonder about that too, where Jesus is talking about him returning, but he first says, "Then you'll see the sign of the Son of Man in the sky." And I never really thought about it. I guess I just thought that the sign was him showing up, but no. When I went back and looked at it, I said, no, it looks like there's something that heralds is coming.
Exactly. That's the whole point of the book. The point of the book is to figure out what is the heavenly sign. That says that in the introduction. Read the introduction. It gives a nice summary. The point of the book is to figure out what is this heavenly sign and why does it herald a second coming? What does it have to do at the end of the age? And the whole book is describing how this book, the sign is actually a planet that comes and goes every 2,000 years, which he uses every once in a while to come back. 2000 BC, he visited Abraham bodily. Abraham was believed to have been born after the appearance of a new star. Jesus, of course, 2,000 years later was born under the sign of a new star.
That's
and now
true.
2,000 years later, if Jesus returns again, he'll return as this planet appears as a sign of the Son of Man. And the end of the age as described in Matthew 24. That's the purpose of that is the inspiration for the title.
I had forgotten about that Abraham was born under the sign of a star too. That's in I think the Joshua, maybe the book of Joshua.
The Apocalypse of Abraham or the Testament of Abraham. It's not a reliable source, but it's interesting that he was thought to be born under a star as well, because that would have fit the paradigm not only of Job and the destruction of Sumer, which did occur about 2000 BC, according to these Sumerian accounts. Their god Enlil appeared in heaven, it was equivalent of Marduk, or to the Yahweh of the Old Testament. Their concept, their high god, appeared in heaven and cast down a heavenly spear upon Sumer. And they believed Enlil was probably the same as Marduk, which is probably Planet X. So there's a description of what was probably Planet X appearing in heaven in the Sumerian texts around 2000 BC, which threw down a meteor apparently, which destroyed Sumer and also wiped out Job.
Interesting. Now, we only got about 9 minutes left, but just real quick, what would your thoughts be on who or what inhabited the prior Earth before Genesis 6:2?
My theory was that Satan came down, based on the previous patterns of how Satan operates. God would create something and Satan would corrupt it. So God created the earth in its original form. Satan came down, just started experimenting with stuff. Maybe he created the dinosaurs at that time, explaining why they're so much older and just kind of screwed up and not in accordance to the pattern which God later created. He had kind of a pre-creation where he was trying to usurp God's attempt to create mankind and create a monstrous race of his own. And God wiped that out with the giant impact and destroyed the previous earth and everything on it. And then created the new heavens and new earth. And then Satan came down and corrupted that one, so there's been a constant running battle against God and Satan to keep it from totally corrupting it again. He sent the flood to clean it. He sent the Israelites to wipe out the giants, to wipe out Satan's works during that period of time, and he'll return again at the end of the age to wipe out the workings of Satan at that time, and again he'll wipe out the working of Satan at the end of the millennium. And at that point, in my opinion, after a series of conflicts with Satan, it'll become absolutely clear in the Father's eyes that Satan is irredeemed and irredeemable. So he'll decide, this is it. cannot be redeemed. We'll have to get rid of him forever. Even though he was this great being, it was very useful to me. He's just more trouble than he's worth. So they trap him in the pit again, and they throw him and the entire earth and everything in it into the sun, where he is and everything about him and the entire memory of him will be destroyed and trapped forever.
Wow. Okay. I got another question. What is your take on the Hopi's prophecy and the red and blue Kachinas? Is that related to this?
I don't know. The blue Kachina doesn't seem to fit because Planet X, or at least Nibiru, is described in the Sumerian texts. And Sitchin was right. Nibiru does describe an unusual star, which was different than the other ones. It's described in the actual Sumerian text as at first appearance being blood red, not blue. So maybe they are talking about Planet X, maybe they're not. But the color blue does not match the description of that given in the Sumerian text, which I think are the primary ones. That said, it could well be. I really don't know.
Do you think maybe it's got other things in tow? You know, like a moon or something along with it?
Could be. You mean Planet X or the
yeah.
star?
Yeah.
Planet X?
Yeah.
Planet X has all kinds of, probably has all kinds of junk in its orbit. This is what I believe hits the Earth during the tribulation period. There's probably a huge amount of debris that was kept in its orbit as a result of the giant impact. In fact, as you can imagine, when I say, for example, I use as a truck goes through an intersection and hits a car, there's going to be all kinds of junk all over the place. It's just not going to be a clean hit. There's going to be stuff everywhere. There's going to be bits of the car left in the truck, which will occasionally fall up as it continues on its journey. And that's what it's like with Planet X. There's all kinds of huge asteroids and comets and who knows what traveling in its orbit with it. And that's the stuff that's going to strike Earth that precedes it in its orbit before it passes near. It's going to pass near Earth. It's going to pass into Earth's atmosphere. Stuff's going to hit Earth directly, which is why you have these massive impacts described, where the entire Earth is shaken and the sun is delayed in its orbit. This is what's happening. It's being hit by massive asteroids that are in the orbital path of Planet X, which explains why they all hit at once instead of just there's no randomness here. There's a reason this is happening. And the description of the sign appearing in heaven, which people are terrified of, it says all the tribes will mourn. Why would they mourn a sign appearing in heaven if there wasn't a sign of imminent danger? That's why I'm convinced that Planet X, or something like it, is the sign of the Son of Man. All the evidence, all the ancillary evidence, all the corollary areas, it all points clearly to the idea that Planet X will return in the end times as the sign of the Son of Man in the end of the age.
Oh, fantastic. I'll tell you what, you give me a lot to think about, a lot to research. I consider myself a researcher. Many of you have heard me say that before, and by that I mean I research that which has been searched by others before me. And so you've given me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight. And man, I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep reading your book and then see if we can schedule another time to do this again.
Absolutely.
Well, fantastic. Well, we got about 3 minutes left, so why don't you give your contact information out again so people can get your book and check it out for themselves and contact you.
The major book we've been talking about is called Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age. It's available from survivormall.com. That's survivormall.com, survivormall.com. You can access that from my website at planet-x.info. That's planet-x.info. You can also get it directly from Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com or order through your local bookstore. There's both a print and Kindle version available on Amazon.com. The other website I have is Mysterious World. There's a lot of material on the Giants, mysteriousworld.com. I will also have a book on the Giants coming out later this year through Defender Press, which will cover more about what we were talking about in the Giants, plus a lot more, plus my theories on the mysterious Zohar, which is a mysterious stone, which I believe which ancient Jewish sages believed contained all knowledge and was also a communications device.
And I have to say that I found Doug's work really fascinating, and I probably wouldn't have even looked into it until I had an interview with Zen Garcia a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have seen that or listened to that show. You can check it out in the archives if you haven't. And he put a few seeds in my mind regarding the creation account, and I've always kind of held what's called the gap theory, kind of, I don't know, at arm's length, I guess. I mean, I've remained open to it. I've looked at Genesis 6:1 and 2, and I've read a lot of the arguments regarding the so-called gap theory there, and I found it really interesting because right away you see, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then all of a sudden it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and it talks about the Spirit of God moving across the face of the waters. Well, the first thing I thought of, and this is years ago, I mean, I'm talking probably 15, 20 years ago, I was looking at that, and I was thinking, where'd the water come from? And some people would say, well, when God created the earth, he created the water with it. But it doesn't appear to be that way, at least to me. When you look at the Hebrew word, even for heavens, Shemaim, Maim is the word for water, and Shem is the word for name. Shem, I think, has something to do with in it. Some say that the word heaven itself means water in it. So it appears that the heavens and the earth actually came out of the water. And when you look at all of the various things in the creation account, it's the one element that is not actually described as being created. It appears to just be there. So I've always had a question mark regarding the whole Genesis 6:1 and 6:2 and the possibility of a gap in there. And but I never really did much with it until I talked with Zen Garcia. And he planted a few seeds in my mind regarding that whole idea, and the idea of the war of God and Leviathan, or the dragon, or Tiamat, or Rahab, the various different names that battle the dragon, the sea serpent, or whatever is known by. And when he planted that seed, I started looking, and I realized that when I bought Tom Horn's special package deal on the David Flynn collection, that Doug Elwell's book, Planet X, the sign of the Son of Man and the coming, the sign of the Son of Man and the end of the age, actually came with the David Flynn set. So I started looking through it, and I said, oh man, I got to talk to this guy. So I contacted him via email through his website, and he's going to be on the show tonight. Douglas is the publisher of Mysterious World. You might want to check that website out. It's really cool. MysteriousWorld.com, an online journal dedicated to travel history and the ancient mysteries of the world. Doug has a master's degrees in Biblical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies and Marketing Communications from Wheaton College Graduate School, and voluminous amounts of experience in researching and writing on religion, history, mythology, and travel. And his first book, Mysterious World Ireland, received critical acclaim, and he's got a few more out there, including the one we're going to talk about tonight, Planet X, the sign of the Son of Man and the end of the age. So it is my great privilege to welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project, Douglas Elwell. Doug, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks so much for coming on. I've just begun your book. I'm probably 50 pages or so into it, and it's blowing my mind. So I'm excited to talk with you about this stuff tonight. But let's go back a little bit further and help us understand who you are beyond the introduction I just gave you. How did you come to know Christ, and how did you even become interested in subjects like Nephilim and giants, Planet X, and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I come from a very conservative, traditional family, a very Christian family. My parents were both saved when they were in their teens and 20s, and they took their faith very seriously. They ingrained that faith in myself and my brother very strongly as soon as we could understand the word Jesus. And then as soon as we were able to understand it, what that meant, they had us confess Christ, I believe, when I was maybe less than 5 years old, even though I didn't really maybe understand completely what was going on. I felt it in my heart. So since then, I felt that I'd been saved, and really kind of felt that I had meant to be saved. I'm actually kind of leaning towards more of a predestinational perspective, so that's guaranteed to offend someone. So, but I tend to be more of a predestinational type person, as if people were meant to be saved. God chose you. But so along those lines, I come from a very conservative background theologically, which some people might find surprising, given some of the outlandish and non-traditional approaches I use with books such as Planet X and the Giants, even though technically the book on the Giants is the conservative viewpoint writ large. I take that conservative viewpoint literally, saying there literally were fallen angels that came down and literally interbred with human women and literally created giant men and women. And so that's actually the conservative viewpoint. So you can see how topsy-turvy things are in these end times when the conservative traditional viewpoint is considered to be strange, and the liberal viewpoint is taken as normative, because the viewpoint that, for example, there's three major theories about the giants. One, that they were actually descendants of fallen angels and mortal women. The other is that they were just Oriental despots who conquered and controlled people through use of force. And others just regular men who were just very aggressive. And the third one was there was actually men from the line of Seth, which makes no sense. That is, because the line of Seth is exactly the opposite of that kind of aggression. They were godly men who had descended from Seth, from whom Jesus was eventually born. The line of Cain, of course, was destroyed by the flood, so Seth was the only one who continued on through Noah and on through the post-flood world. But so that very conservative theologically. But when it comes to the Bible, I like to look to modern science and new understandings of archaeology and of mythology to understand or to glean new and better understandings of the Bible. This is actually normative for academic level stuff. When you get into academic level stuff like Mike Heiser does, I could have continued on in that path like he did, but I decided to go more towards technology as a career, but I still studied the Bible in its original languages on my own. And when I studied in grad school, they actually do study the Bible in its cultural context, and a lot of our modern translations of the Bible are actually based on better understandings of ancient Near Eastern mythology, ancient Near Eastern contract law, things of that nature. We have a much better understanding of the dating of the scriptures based on, for example, the Pharaonic kings list of the Egyptians and the dating of certain styles of contract that were written in the ancient Near East. We can date, for example, the time period when Joseph was sold for, I believe it was 30 shekels of silver. That was actually the specific time period in ancient history where that was the price of a slave, so we could date him to that period and prove that Joseph lived during that time. Things like that. And so I treat astronomy the same way, is that when you come with new understandings of astronomy, you then need to apply these to our understanding of the creation so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on. And if you have a revolutionary improvement in our understanding of astronomy, you're going to have a revolutionary improvement in our understanding of the creation. I believe that's what I've come across and talk about in my book, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man in the End of the Age.
Very good. I spent a little bit of time poking around your website as well, Mysterious World. How did that come about? How did you get into all the stuff that's on that website?
I noticed there was not really a Christian perspective on some of these mysterious topics, and I tend to take a little more lenience towards non-biblical texts and extra-biblical texts like and ancient histories that are outside of the Bible. For example, South American history, North American history, European history. I take these things seriously, and I like to apply them to my understanding of the Bible. I use the biblical understanding as kind of the center post around which I array all these other ancient mythologies and histories, and kind of do a comparison and contrast and see where there are parallels. And as such, it's like my academic training, except I extend it to a worldwide scope rather than just ancient Near Eastern texts. I extend it. How was the world back then? How do people think? And there are numerous parallels and indications that the giants, for example, spread all over the world, not just ancient Near East. They were conquered the entire world. That was, in fact, their purpose, in my opinion, was to conquer the world and take over the various tribes of the nations in order to form royal classes which would rule over them on behalf of the fallen angels who would use them as sort of an intermediary. And those royal classes are still in place today. For example, the royals of England are probably descended from Nephilim stock, as are all the other royalties that still remain. And probably why they may call them blue bloods, because their blood literally is different from most people's for that reason.
So you do subscribe to the idea that many of the world leaders could actually be of a different race, let's say, than the human race?
They are modified humans. They have been altered. They've intermarried with standard Homo sapiens for a long time now, so there's not much difference. But in ancient times, thousands of years ago, in some cases hundreds, they were very similar. They were actually fairly dissimilar from standard humans. They were much taller, much stronger, and there was distinct differences. And there's a number of references to giants of the ancient world, even ancient Europe, that were much taller than the average person. So there are actual records of giants in the world, not just the ancient Near East or even Europe. They're all over the place. So we can find an example here. Let me find a specific name. There's actually the giant German ruler, for example, if I can find his name, Maximinus, that's right, he was the Roman emperor. He was actually 8.5 feet tall, and he was actually an enormous man. He wasn't simply suffering from some sort of pituitary disorder. He was literally a giant man. He was extremely powerful. He could outrun horses, and even at one time he even knocked out a horse's teeth with one punch. This guy was so strong. He was actually from Bulgaria. He was an old Bulgarian giant. And he was actually able to outrun horses, and he ate probably enough for 10 men every day. In fact, after a while, the army so admired this man, they made him emperor. But he actually ended up bankrupting Rome because he offered the army's double pay, and had to sack all of the old temples, the priests of all their gold and everything just to pay the army. So he eventually was deposed and assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. But he was a literal giant, 8.5 feet tall in real history. Maximilian, the emperor of one of the Holy Roman Empires, was actually, I think he was over 8 feet tall as well, and he was also very strong. He would wrestle with lions, and he could outrun mountain goats, and even climb mountains faster than mountain goats could, according to the stories. And he was a classic example of an ancient giant in modern times, relatively modern times. I believe he lived about 400 years ago. And maybe it was 700 or 800 years ago. Actually, yeah, it was 1493. And he was an honest-to-goodness giant in recorded history. So these people actually did live, and they actually were a part of royal lines. Maximilian being a classic example of a Germanic giant that formed a royal line, from whom his descendants are still German royalty. So when I say I believe they're German royalty, it's because that's what the history says.
Yeah, that's interesting. Somebody had done an animation showing wars throughout history, and they basically showed the globe, and it showed little explosions going off in different places where wars had taken place over, I think it was about the last 1,000+ years or so. And the bigger the explosion, the bigger the war, and the more the casualties, you know. So of course, when you see like World War I and World War II, there's some pretty big explosions, you know, all over Europe and whatnot. But what struck me as I was watching that animation is that literally for at least 1,000 years, a lot of wars have been started in Germany.
Yes, those are the homeland of the ancient Germanic giants, the largest, strongest, and most fierce of all the giants. In fact, all the other giants were actually afraid of them, even the Gaulish giants whom Caesar fought against in his campaigns against the Gauls. He actually wrote about this in his writings about how huge the Gauls were. And they would fight naked. They were upwards of 8 feet tall, had huge two-handed swords, and just could go through men like a lawnmower. And the only way the Romans could defeat the Gaulish giants was by forming phalanxes and using arrows and javelins, because they were vulnerable to arrows and javelins because they did not use armor, believing their gods would protect them. So they eventually wiped all of the Gauls after massive casualties, but they eventually killed them all. But the Germani were the most aggressive of all. And those are the ones that Hitler tried to rebreed in his master race ideology, which was based on real history. He actually went around to the various areas like Poland and northern France, looking for tall blonde children, and he brought them back to state-sponsored brothels called Lebensraum in order to try to rebreed the master race. Meanwhile, I forget the name of the Nazi doctor. He was actually trying to rebreed the giants by breeding people specifically for that purpose. He actually, Mengele was his name.
Yeah, Mengele.
The story of Boys from Brazil was basically based on a real story, where he was actually experimenting with people and trying to rebreed the giants, and that's why you have a lot of blue-eyed children in certain parts. I think it was, if not Brazil, I think it was actually in Argentina. But he was actually doing these experiments, trying to rebreed this giant race, and that's the reason he was experimenting on children in Auschwitz, particularly twins, because I think that his theory was that a giant was basically a conjoined twin that had been fused in a womb to one large person. It's based on his research. I backwards extrapolated that. I think that was probably his theory. Perhaps occasionally in history you hear of two-headed giants. That is most likely a conjoined twin. It was basically two heads and one body, which does actually happen. It can happen. It's happened in recorded history and medical history. So the idea of the Germanic giants, they were trying to rebreed them, was actually based on real history. These people actually did exist, and Hitler made a real attempt to bring these people back.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me, and the fact that he was looking for blonde hair and blue eyes, which both are recessive